Good evening. My name is Lauren Lele, and I am the Senior Director of Community Health at Newton-Wellesley Hospital. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our program titled Planning for Caregiving. Where do I start? Tonight's program is part of our ongoing community education series and is being co-hosted by the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Elder Care and Palliative Care Councils. These councils are part of the 8 within the Community Collaborative. Before the program officially starts, I would like to mention a few logistics. We will be leaving plenty of time for questions and answers and would ask that you use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to type your questions in. I will monitor these questions and be asking them of our panelists at the end of the speaking portion of the program. We have 2 panelists for tonight. Dr. Julie Nordstrand has worked in the clinical and academic and research fields of aging with her PhD in social work and research expertise in age-friendly communities. In addition, through her master's in social work, she gained extensive experience in assessing the individual and the environment in which they live. And through her master's in clinical psychology, she gained critical clinical skills in the field of mental health. Julie's 15 years working in the field of aging have included serving on boards with aging-related missions, helping caregivers and older adults in the community set up peer-led support groups, and teaching aging-related courses, all of which have provided her in-depth knowledge of the aging experience, specifically related to physical, emotional, and cognitive changes. Dr. Kosha Thakur was appointed Director of the Palliative Care Service at Newton-Wellesley Hospital in the fall of 2017. Dr. Thakur obtained her medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine and completed her residency training in internal medicine at the University of Michigan. In 2009, she joined the medical staff of Newton-Wellesley Hospital as a hospitalist and saw an opportunity to make an impact on the care of the seriously ill by joining the Palliative Care Service in 2011. She achieved board certification in hospice and palliative medicine in 2012. As a member of the Palliative Care Service, Dr. Thakur pursued a specific interest in palliative care education and created a curriculum for interns and medical students rotating on the Palliative Care Service. She sits on the Partners Palliative Care Committee, as well as on the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Cancer Care Committee. I think you will find what Julie and Dr. Thakur have to share will be valuable in providing you education, insight, and guidance as you think about aspects of caregiving planning in your life. To begin our evening, we wanted to start with a personal story. And as we were planning for the program, it became apparent that in addition to emceeing, I was someone who could very much share that reflection. I will be brief, but I hope my words will convey why I consider the content of this webinar so important and critical as someone embarks on a health journey with a family friend or a family member. My sister, who was 2 years older than me and my only sibling, passed away from a brain tumor 4 years ago, an illness she lived with for 20 years. My remarks are not focused on her disease, but to share what was important to me and my family during that time. Her illness took various paths and over time worsened. And it was in those last years that we were able to plan for how her care would look. The words that jump to my mind during those times are the importance of awareness, patience, and communication. We are fortunate to have a very close family, all of whom were involved in some way for my sister's care. This, I realize, is not a luxury that everyone has. Over this long period of time, it required all of us to be flexible to change. Emotionally, to realize family members were at different places as her ability to interact with all of us decreased. Flexible to change accommodations that had to occur in her home, such as a newly designed bathroom, placing a hospital bed in the common living space on the first floor, and when even more care was required, a change of work and overall schedules. Caregiving planning involves reflecting on what is important to the person who is ill and thinking how to accommodate that. It may seem silly, but my sister had beautiful white teeth. So for us, one of those daily tasks was to help her brush her teeth, a function that may seem so simple, but was extraordinarily hard for her to do. This reflection not only includes the person who is ill, but also thinking about what is significant for the caregivers. My personal example is that my brother-in-law is a talented musician and very engaged with music at his church, playing every week at multiple services. When my sister could no longer be alone and to enable him to keep up with his music, we made a plan that I would go to their house every Sunday morning at 7 a.m. and spend those 5 hours being with my sister. For me, months of doing this are such special memories at a very hard time for all of us. Early on, my sister and I would chat, or I would get her showered and ready for the day. But as her illness progressed and she became non-functioning, we would just be next to each other, hold hands, and I would watch her sleep. I share this to say that caregiving, and when it can be planned for, can be powerful and life-giving at extraordinarily difficult times. So while it was very painful and we experienced great sadness when my sister passed away, there was also peace and comfort in knowing that our caregiving made a difference to her, as well as to all of us in our family. Thank you for that opportunity to share my personal story. I would now like to turn our program over to Julie to present her presentation. Thank you.
Lauren, thank you. Thank you so much. That was such an amazing description that you gave, and reflects so much of the work that I've been doing with the many individuals and families that I have worked with. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoints. Thank you so much for inviting me for this presentation tonight, which is a critically important topic, as there are many, many families out there who are struggling with how to provide support for their loved ones. My name is Julie Norstrand, and I am an elder care consultant, and I focus on helping the caregiver become as an effective a caregiver as possible. In other words, I help them plan for the needed skills and knowledge required for caregiving. Unfortunately, over the years, as I've been working with families who are faced with caregiving responsibilities, I have come to realize that many people generally enter a caregiving role with no or little planning. Indeed, according to a Fidelity Caregiver Survey from 2021, only about 15% of people reported having some plan in place. I cannot tell you how often I've heard people say to me, if only they'd known who to reach out to or where to begin in terms of preparing for caregiving, then their initial experience would have been a little, if not a lot easier. The problem with lack of planning is that it makes the caregiving experience much more stressful, and the caregiver may suffer physically, mentally, socially, and economically. You may already have read up on this when searching about caregiving on the internet. Therefore, what I'm sharing with you here tonight is based on the advice I've given to my clients over the years regarding what you can do to help yourself as you take on more and more caregiving duties. Before I start my talk, I just want to say a few words about myself in terms of my own caregiving experience. I experienced the challenges of caregiving through seeing what my parents went through with their own parents, and then much later with my own mom's end-of-life care. My mom passed away just over 10 years ago. These experiences made me realize the immense impact that caregiving has, not just on the individual, but the whole family. Of course, since then, I've gained so much more insight into the caregiving experience through friends, colleagues, and especially my clients. It is something that truly impacts us all in some way. Before I continue, I just want to emphasize one point, and that is that this presentation is going to focus on caregiving for those who are caring for an older parent or an older loved one, such as a spouse. I'm not going to be discussing caregiving for children with special needs. So for this webinar tonight, I'm going to focus on the following. First, I'm going to talk about evaluating the situation, as in when is an appropriate time to step in. Then starting the ongoing conversation and what it should consist of. Setting up a plan collaboratively, that being with your aging parent or loved one, as well as any family members or anyone else who might become involved in the caregiving plan. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Aging Service Network. In other words, the services and resources available in your community. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the work-life balance, as well as self-care for caregivers. And the last few slides are going to be to help you step by step as you take on the caregiving role. So what I've found when working with families is that often they will ask, when is it appropriate to step in and offer help to a loved one? Well, of course, there is no simple answer to this question, as each case is always so unique. But in general, I've found that the following to be good guidelines for families. So for example, subtle signs might include, for example, forgetfulness that can't just be blamed by a bad night's sleep. Also possibly a loss of routine or interest, or uncertainty or confusion about routine activities. Maybe a change or worsening in appearance, and also the house or the garden deteriorating. But then as time progresses, signs can certainly become much more life-threatening. For example, food burnt on the stove, dents or scratches on the car, a sudden weight loss, mood change, and this is often in older adults seen in terms of depression or anxiety, possibly an increased use of alcohol or inappropriate use of medication. I just want to give you a quick story about a personal experience that I had approximately 12 years ago. And that was my grandmother, who was living independently at home on her own. And this was very important to her to continue living on her own. However, unfortunately, looking back on it, her situation certainly started to exhibit some of the more life-threatening scenarios, with numerous times where food was left on the stove and became burnt. This became apparent to her two daughters, and within the month, things deteriorated so quickly that she ended up falling into her pool, which during the winter time, there was a little bit of water in the pool. And she was heard by a neighbor calling for help. And luckily, this neighbor heard her and could provide help. Now, this, of course, is certainly quite a dramatic example of what can happen if you don't pay attention. But it certainly made a huge impression on me. And so I always urge families to step in before the major problems arise. Another question that I'm often asked by families is how to start the conversation with their parent or loved one. Starting to talk about how to support an aging relative as they become more fragile and dependent is, of course, never easy. It's just not a fun topic to bring up. But if you never talk about it, how can you learn what they want? For example, do they want to stay as long as possible in their own home? Or do they want to downsize or move to a senior residential place? Another important topic that should be brought up is what kind of transportation services are available in their area for when they no longer feel comfortable to drive. This is so difficult to bring up, but we have to. So again, to reiterate, you cannot start planning until you start the conversation. So when it comes to starting the conversation, it's important to reflect on the following points. First, who is the best messenger? Is it you, the adult child? Or might it be someone else in the family? Or a friend? Maybe their primary care physician or a neighbor? I always encourage people to think a little bit about this. Sometimes the adult child might not always be the right person because of the implied change in the child to parent dynamic. In other words, your parent has always been the strong one, the provider, the one who could manage a situation. And now, by you coming to them, it becomes obvious that the roles are reversing. And that can be a bitter pill to swallow. Another thing to think about is, when is the best time to have this conversation? Often I hear on the news or social media how events such as Thanksgiving or other holiday events are the time to have these kinds of conversations, as this is when the family's gathered. But I honestly don't agree with this, as family gatherings are often way too noisy, too much going on. It's just not a conducive environment. What you need to do is to find a time when the person is feeling alert, rested, and if applicable, pain-free. Often I've found with families, they'll report that mid-mornings or afternoons work for many people. However, this is hopefully something that you have a good sense of. Now, of course, how do you bring something like this up? Again, it depends on who your parent or loved one is. For example, is it best to be direct with them and express your concerns very explicitly? Or is it best to be more indirect and perhaps bring up another family where they have discussed this topic? What I find is a good rule of thumb is not to make "you must" or "you need to" kind of statements, but more open-ended questions or statements. This will more likely open up for a conversation. Finally, I want to emphasize that this should not be considered a one-time conversation, but an ongoing one. As things change, opinions change, life circumstances can change for them as well as for the family. In other words, the support system. Now, when working with families over the years, I aim to cover these basic areas and possibly others, depending on their situation. First, in terms of health, I strongly encourage you to have a good sense of what is going on in terms of their health. Now, remember, health is a very multifaceted concept. In other words, it doesn't just mean any chronic physical conditions that they might have, but also their mental health, as well as their memory. Two main points I want to make about this is, first, is there something with their health that you need to know about that could impact them going forward that they may not have told you about? Second, you need a good understanding of what medications are they taking. And ultimately, if they're willing and you are able to, you should go to a medical appointment with them so that you can get a much better picture of what is going on. And this also provides you with an opportunity to get your name on the HIPAA authorization and release form. In other words, that will enable you to be included on information about your loved one's health circumstances. Then, now moving on to financial and estate planning. And I cannot emphasize enough, this is a huge topic that really must be tackled proactively. In order to understand, get an understanding of their financial situation, you need an overview of their assets and liabilities. Now, assets can include cash, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, and bank deposits, whereas liabilities can refer to auto loans, mortgages, credit card loans, and even student loans. Basically, you need a complete sense of their financial situation so that you know what kind of services they can afford, for example. Another thing that I found with families is they don't always know whether their loved one has long-term care insurance or life insurance. So that's certainly something that you should be asking about. In terms of estate planning, I like to look at it in two ways: documentation related to the assets, and then documentation related to the healthcare. So firstly, estate planning in regards to assets. You have the power of attorney, and this is the individual who is appointed to make decisions about their assets. And then the last will and testament, that is the legal document that explains when and how the beneficiaries will inherit the property and assets. It's very important to get this document written, because without it, if the person suddenly dies, the estate will then go into probate and stay there much longer. And this will ultimately increase the costs, the legal costs to get this cleared up. So please make sure that the last will and testament has been done. As part of the last will, an executor, this is an individual who can be appointed to administer the last will and testament of the deceased person. Now, of course, this person should be someone that can be trusted and that they will carry out what the will indicates. And just as a point of clarification, the power of attorney acts when the person is alive, while the executor acts when the person has passed away. The power of attorney and executor is generally the same person. Estate planning in terms of health, there you have something called the healthcare proxy. This is the individual who's appointed to make medical decisions on behalf of the individual should they become unconscious and unable to make decisions for themselves. It's very important that the healthcare proxy has a very good understanding of what that person wants in terms of their health care treatment, including circumstances under which the person wants certain medicines or life-saving treatments, as well as the desired form of burial and any other special life-saving treatments. It's important to note that the healthcare proxy loses their power if the individual gains consciousness and is able to speak for themselves. The living will is created at the same time as a healthcare proxy, and this is the document that spells out the specific wishes around the life-prolonging treatments in the event of a terminal illness. On this slide here, you'll see also reference to the MOLST, the medical orders of life-sustaining treatment, as well as the 5 wishes. These are excellent websites for advanced care planning. And I'm not going to go into this now, as Dr. Thakur is going to talk about this after me. Moving on to where to live. This is another incredibly important topic to discuss in terms of where your loved one wants to live. The research indicates that the vast majority of older people want to remain in their own homes as long as they live. This is a term that we call aging in place. Now, this is certainly understandable since we tend to prefer what we know, including our community and the home we may have lived in for decades. Now, for this to work, often people can make changes to the home in order to make it safer, including, for example, adding non-slip strips in the bathtub and shower, applying non-slip wax on floors, putting non-skid treads on steps, removing throw rugs, lowering things in the kitchen to make them easier to reach, replacing standard doorknobs with lever handles, and replacing toilet with a raised or high-profile toilet. AARP provides lots of great ideas for how you can make a home safer. And indeed, the National Association of Home Builders and AARP have developed the Certified Aging in Place Specialists program, also known as CAPS. So it's certainly worth looking into this program. Other options in terms of living could be that your loved one, such as your aging parent, could come and live with you. However, I've often found that this is generally not a feasible option for many families, simply because of the size of their homes, and also that these homes may not be suitable for someone with increased frailty. Of course, there are also senior living residences, including independent living, assisted living, memory care, as well as nursing home. And in the last few slides of this presentation, you'll see search links that will enable you to find out more information about these different options. Then finally, another important area to cover is getting an understanding of what their routine activities are like, as this will give you a sense of where you might start to provide some help. Often a key point is whether they can or should continue to drive. The reason why this is so important is because if and when they can no longer drive, this can prevent them from continuing their routine activities, and ultimately they can become isolated and lonely, especially if living on their own. So to prevent this, you should really start to look at what public transportation options are available, so that you can ensure that they can continue doing the things that are important to them, such as visiting with friends or going out to a favorite restaurant. Throughout this, the key point when you're discussing these different topics that I've just covered is to be keenly aware of what their wishes are, and that you're not imposing your own beliefs or thoughts on them. So as you're learning about your loved one's situation and getting a sense of where help might be needed and where changes need to be made, it is important not to go it alone. Ultimately, you should aim to work collaboratively with your parents or loved one, as well as other family members. This often is your siblings, but basically anyone who's likely to become involved. Also, it's really important that you make your loved one feel that they are making the decisions and taking the lead. Otherwise, you are likely to run into resistance later on. However, I fully acknowledge that when you're working with a loved one who is experiencing dementia or any memory impairment, then reliance on their opinions and their decisions is certainly very tricky. what I've found helpful for families when they are working on a future care plan is to start to think about what each person is good at. So allocate responsibilities according to personal strengths. Some are good at the more practical stuff, such as making house repairs or paying bills, searching for information on the internet, while others may be more suited at the more emotional support and providing compassion. So this may require some introspection and sometimes a bit of creativity. But the point about this is, I think you are much more likely to get buy-in from other family members if you ask them to do things that they are already good at and possibly enjoy. Often I found with the families that I'm working with that the son will take on the financial responsibility, or he may be the one who's doing the fixes in the home. And the adult daughter is the one who takes on the more emotional and the hands-on tasks. But of course, each family is very different, and each child may have a very different relationship with their parent. So that certainly dictates the role that they take in this care planning development. Finally, again, I can't express enough how important it is that as you're starting to come up with some sort of plan, that it is critical that you always put the person who needs the help at the center of the planning as much as possible. You want to support their autonomy, independence, and dignity. Another area that I found to be super critical to become knowledgeable about is the kinds of services and resources available for older adults in your community. I find that people are often surprised by how much is available. What I'm referring to here is the Aging Network. This was established by the Older Americans Act in 1965, and it's a national network of federal, state, and local agencies whose mission is to plan and provide services that help older adults and people of all ages with disabilities to live independently in their homes and communities for as long as possible. It's found across the 50 states and provides services for people 60 and older when focusing on older adults, but there is certainly variability in terms of age cutoff. One of the complexities of the Aging Network is that the names of different types of services are called something different across the states, which can cause quite a bit of confusion. But let me show you this next slide here. This slide is a very busy slide, I realize that, and I'm hoping in your own time when you get a chance to review this video that you can take a good look at the vast array of services that the Aging Network can provide. But one thing I really want you to focus in on is something here at the bottom called the Elder Care Locator, which is an excellent website, and it provides a very comprehensive list of services in your area. So the way it works is that you go onto the website, you put in your zip code, and it will provide any of the Aging Network agencies or services that are available within your neighborhood or community. And each of these different agencies will provide information to you. So if you have a question, someone is always there to help you. The cost of these services vary widely. For families that are financially struggling, they can go to a website here at the very bottom called Benefits Checkup to see if they're eligible for assistance. And Benefits Checkup basically connects struggling seniors to programs that can help them with, for example, food, utilities, medicines, and more. So again, if you're helping someone who is financially struggling, definitely worth checking out Benefits Checkup. Now, many of you on this webinar here tonight may be working full or part-time. So it is important that you know what you can and should expect from your employer. But I just want to give you a quick background of what the typical employee caregiver looks like. In 2020, we had approximately 53 million caregivers in this country caring for a child with special needs or an older adult. And this represented about 1 in 5 adults being caregivers in the US population. And the majority of these people were also holding down a job, specifically 61%. And this is when considering the fact that on average, caregivers spend about 20 hours or more per week on providing caregiving responsibilities. When you think of that, and that they're working on top of that, it is very evident that the work-life balance becomes very tricky. So it should not be surprising that many caregivers feel that the only alternative is to exit the workforce. But when considering that the average age of a caregiver is 49 years old, this exit should be carefully considered because it can result in significant income and benefit losses over the lifetime. Indeed, a caregiver who exits prematurely, their average loss in income and benefits over their lifetime averages about $304,000. So if you're in a situation where you feel that you need some time off, it is important that you look into what types of services and resources that your employer might have. First one to know about is FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. And this is something that gives you the right to take time off due to illness or to take care of an ill dependent without losing your job. This law guarantees that eligible employees can take up to 12 weeks of minimal paid leave. Here in Massachusetts, you can earn a maximum of approximately $1,130 per week. Now, these 12 weeks can be used all at once or in increments as short as a few hours at a time. It's important to note that in order to qualify for FMLA, an employee must have worked for their employer for at least 12 months. The law applies to all workers in all government agencies and schools nationwide, as well as those in private companies with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. Another thing to look into is the Employer Assistance Program. And this is a voluntary work-based program that offers free and confidential assessments, short-term counseling, referrals, and follow-up services to employees who have a personal and or work-related problems. And some companies provide EAPs that have specialists that specifically can address elder care issues. So again, definitely worth asking your employer whether they do provide this at your job. And finally, ERGs, these are employer resource groups. These are a newer concept and they're employee run, and they tend to focus on specific issues that are important for employees. And some workplaces do have ERGs that specifically focus on caregiver issues. And these can also be very supportive to employees. Now, here for the last part of my presentation, this is really about self-care and support that you as the caregiver need to look at for your own mental well-being. I can't stress enough that caregiving can be both rewarding as well as very demanding and challenging. This is why it's so important to reach out for help from others. I, through my work with caregiver support groups have learned so much from my caregivers about the emotional challenges that many of them face, especially those who are providing care for a loved one on their own. I do just want to give you a quick story about a caregiver that once called me a couple of years ago. This was late in the evening, and she was providing care for her two parents, both age 91. And she was in her 60s. She had quit her work, and she was so stressed out, especially because she was caring for these two parents all on her own. She was burning through her retirement funds. She was getting no sleep, and she just needed someone to talk to. And I happened to be that person. And I must admit, I didn't feel as if I was able to provide her any help right there and then, other than to recommend her to reach out to her local council on aging. But for her at that point, she just needed someone to talk to. And I found that through the work of the caregiver support groups, that is an invaluable role that many caregiver support groups provide, is that they give them, the caregivers, a safe place to really express how they're feeling, and to be able to do so in a space where they can feel heard and listened to and not judged. I have found often that caregivers will say that people who have not done any caregiving find it very hard to really understand the stresses of caregiving. As you can see on this slide here, there are various avenues for getting help other than the caregiver support groups. Hopefully, you might have someone in the family that you can reach out to when you're feeling stressed, as well as family, or as well as friends or neighbors. Some people turn to faith-based organizations and get tremendous help through them. And then there's a whole array of respite services. And these basically are something that you would pay for, where you could potentially have your loved one stay at for example, at a nursing home. Nursing homes can provide respite for caregivers so that the caregiver gets a break and they can catch up on sleep, their well-being, and then after some time, their loved one comes back. But many caregivers will often ask me about various respite opportunities. So again, that's something to look into when doing any search on the internet. The other point I just want to point out is that caregivers will often feel very alone in what they're doing. And they find it hard to receive help when help is offered. And the advice that I've given to some families is, when someone does offer help, such as, let me know what I can help you with, don't just say, thank you so much, I'll think about it. That is the time to really say, thank you so much. Can you help me with A, B, and C? And provide that the requests very specifically. Because I think for many people who have not been caregivers, it's very hard for them to really put themselves in your shoes and understand what kinds of assistance or help that you might need. And the other thing I've found is that through the research that I've done is that people tend to like to be asked for help. People want to be helpful to others. So I always, and another thing that I try to remind my caregivers of is, don't be ashamed of asking for help, because the other person is hopefully going to feel honored and feel that you trust them, and that by in itself will make them want to help you. The last thing here on this slide here is recommended resources. These are just internet-based resources that you can go on that provide research literature, they provide recommendations, they provide books, they provide a whole host of information that caregivers may find interesting. There's certainly also websites specifically for Alzheimer's and Alzheimer's support groups. That is also something that I would recommend you look into. These last 3 slides I'm going to show you are really just about helping you to get started. So this slide here just provides you the terminology for some of the domains that I've discussed earlier. And this will hopefully be helpful for you as you try to locate different experts that can be helpful for you as you develop your plan. So just the reason why I created this slide is because often I've found that people will say, well, I don't know what it's called. So this slide here will give you a reminder of some of the important names to be aware of as you're setting up a caregiving plan. This slide here is some of the things to be aware of and how to get started when you're working with an older person who is still independent. The main thing I want to point out here is at the bottom of this slide is a really interesting it's a really interesting website called the Genworth Cost of Care Survey. And this gives you detailed information about the costs of different types of long-term care services in your community. So again, you'll be putting in your zip code or the name of your town, and it'll give you the rough sort of average of the cost of care in that vicinity. And it'll give you the cost of care, whether it's home-based care or whether it's long-term residential care. And I really encourage people to look at this to really get a good sense of what to expect. And this final slide here gives you how to get started when working with more frail elders. And you can look at the home and based community services, and it'll give you a whole array of different things to look into. The PACE program is something that is specific for people in lower income, and it's an excellent service, especially for someone who is at the stage where they need nursing level care, but want to be able to remain in their own home for as long as possible. And it gives a wraparound array of services. However, you must qualify in terms of income base. And then finally here on these links here, you will find different types of senior care, whether it be independent, assisted, nursing home, memory care, and it gives a very nice description of each of those types of care. And then finally, this link here provides you with where these different types of long-term care services are within your area. Thank you so much. And now I am going to pass this on to Dr. Thakur.
Thank you so much, Julie. That was so incredibly informative and thorough. I'm going to now focus more on the interactions with the healthcare system. I'm just getting myself set up. Thank you. I'm honored also as well to speak with you about what you and your loved ones can do to prepare for future needs when interacting with the healthcare system, to ensure that your loved ones' values and goals are always prioritized when making medical decisions, because inevitably with aging and frailty, there can be onset of serious illness. And so preparing for that can help significantly decrease sort of future stress and emotional burden as well. It's not possible to plan for every possible scenario, but you can take the time to understand your loved one's values and wishes ahead of time so you can center them in your plans as the future unfolds. And as a physician who's worked in the hospital setting for 20 years, I have seen firsthand what a significant difference effective planning can have on the patient and caregiver experience. And these topics can sometimes be challenging or sad to discuss, but as I said, it actually ends up alleviating significant emotional burden to embark in this process. And so what I'm talking about specifically is advanced care planning, which is defined as a process that supports adults at any age or any stage of health in understanding and sharing their personal values, life goals, and preferences regarding future medical care. And the goal of advanced care planning is to help ensure that people receive medical care that is consistent with their values during serious and chronic illness, whenever that time does come. And starting conversations early with your loved one can decrease the stress and burden when illness or frailty does arrive. And in the setting, what happens in sort of medical institutions, especially in the setting of serious illness, our culture tends to focus on the treatments and procedures that are available without necessarily focusing on what the impact those treatments could be on day-to-day life and what is truly important to the person and their caregivers. And what we do know through research is that many people who are facing serious debilitating illnesses as they're progressing, such as dementias or progressive kidney disease or advanced cancers, many have not actually had conversations about outcomes or what to expect with their providers until they're well underway with the treatment. And this leads to a great deal of misunderstanding, suffering, anxiety, and poor quality of life. So the goal of advanced care planning is to ensure that people do receive medical care that is consistent with their values and goals when they ultimately do encounter serious illness. Often people will delay advanced care planning because they'll say, oh, it's too early. There's plenty of time for that. However, in the words of Ellen Goodman, it's often too early until it is just too late. So many people do avoid these difficult or uncomfortable conversations about the possibility of serious illness or death because they feel that they're protecting their loved one from negative emotions. However, what ends up happening is that things become very challenging and even stressful, especially for the surrogate decision maker, when they have to make decisions without knowing what their loved one would really want or find important. And this has actually been studied, and at least a third of surrogate decision makers can experience significant negative emotional burden, including diagnoses such as anxiety, complicated grief, and PTSD. And just having conversations and knowing what your loved one's patients and preferences are ahead of time can significantly reduce this negative impact. And it can also help maintain a sense of control for everyone involved and can reduce family conflict. So what are the actual steps of advanced care planning? So we can think about this as a continuous iterative process, as Julie has already shared with us, over the adult lifespan with 3 major touch points that should trigger progression in the process. So the first step is what Julie already shared, is appointing a healthcare proxy and letting your proxy know that they've been appointed and starting to have conversations about what your values are and how they inform how you view your future care. The next is then having ongoing discussions about future care preferences as new health conditions develop, and these can be chronic and stable conditions. And then finally, are serious illness conversations, which are detailed discussions with loved ones and clinicians about the person's current preferences, values, and goals in the near term. And this is specifically in the context of living with the serious illness. So I'm just going to touch on these in a little bit more detail. So the first step, and Julie went through this, is appointing the healthcare proxy. And so what we advocate for is also identifying an alternate proxy as well, just in case the primary proxy is not available. And we actually recommend that you appoint a proxy for any person aged 18 or older. Should think about completing a healthcare proxy form. And we look at it as insurance. You hope you never need it, but in case you need it, you have it. Because what happens if for some reason a major medical decision is needed and you are not able to make a decision on your own behalf and you don't have a proxy, you may have to go to courts to appoint a legal guardian, especially if there's family conflict around decision-making or nursing home placement is required. And that can just result in significant delays and lots of suffering and stress. And in fact, a high percentage of people do end up needing their healthcare proxy to make decisions on their behalf, especially as we age over the age of 60. And certain key points about completing a proxy: an attorney is actually not needed to complete one. You only need 2 witnesses and the person who's appointing the proxy. Neither of the witnesses can be the person who's being identified as a healthcare proxy. And once again, the person who is appointing the healthcare proxy needs to be fully decisional and aware of what they're doing in order to have this be a legally appropriate document. So then the next step is then to have that discussion with your loved ones about your values after you've appointed the proxy. And so what does it mean to have a discussion? How do you start it about what your values and goals are? So if you as a caregiver have been appointed as a proxy for your loved one, consider approaching your loved one with some questions to start off with. And here's a list of some examples of what may help you get a sense of what might be important to your loved one as they encounter the healthcare system more and more. Understanding what makes life worth living for them, what might make it not worth living, what are hopes and fears around future health, and how have healthcare experiences of others impacted your thoughts about the kind of care you would want or not want. And once again, this is a process, not a one-time event. It's like Julie and I are sort of echoing each other here because people's views do change over time. It's possible that, for example, younger people who designate a healthcare proxy who have who currently don't have any disabilities may think that in a future state where there is debility might not be tolerable. But research does show that when ability does change, humans have a remarkable ability to adapt to their new reality. And so it's important to continue to revisit these discussions. And then on the other hand, when somebody might be diagnosed with a serious illness, they may pursue extremely aggressive treatments and interventions. But as the illness progresses, the burdens of the treatments may outweigh any benefit. And at that point, people may wish to transition to non-medical focus of care and move away from invasive treatments. So once again, these are iterative conversations that need to have over time. And so, as I said, these conversations can be challenging and sometimes sad, but they're also critical to successfully navigate this eventuality in life. And so fortunately, here is sort of a list of many resources, toolkits, workbooks, and scripts that are available all online to help guide you with advanced care planning conversations with your loved ones. And after the webinar, you'll be provided with links so you can explore all of these sites and choose what you feel might best meet your needs and preferences. But I'm just going to give a very high level overview of these sites. So the first one, Prepare for Your Care, which is this one here, is an online tool that walks people through 5 advanced care planning steps and then results in a printable advanced care planning action plan. Honoring Choices Massachusetts also does similar advanced care planning, but it also has guides on how to speak with healthcare providers at various stages of health as well. 5 Wishes is a popular platform to use, mostly because it uses actually very simple language and helps start and structure important conversations, and is actually a workbook that you can take notes in real time as you're having a conversation. Cake is a platform which actually is incredibly practical. It provides advice and articles around planning for end of life, including finances, setting a legacy, funeral arrangements, loss and grief support, and exploring mortality. So I found it that functions very nicely as sort of a library and a repository of information. And then finally is the Conversation Project. The Conversation Project is a public health engagement initiative of the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, And it has free guides on various aspects of advanced care planning, including guides on how to start the conversation with your loved one, how to choose a healthcare proxy or how to be a healthcare proxy, how to talk with the healthcare team about whatever illness is being faced, as well as a workbook called What Matters to Me for people who are living with serious illness that you can have questions and you can fill out the answers to then give to your loved one so that they can then know how to advocate for you. There's also a guide for caregivers of people with Alzheimer's or dementia as well. And the goal of the Conversation Project is to help everyone talk about their wishes for care throughout the end of life, so those wishes can be understood and respected. And so then when there's a progression from health to serious illness, the advanced care planning conversation changes from a future state conversation about what might be your preferences in the future to a present tense context. And this is also very important to prepare for as a caregiver and advocate, since it can be overwhelming when you're in the moment and facing a serious illness alongside your loved one. And so to get us all on the same page, the meaning of serious illness in this context is a condition that carries a high risk of mortality and is burdensome in symptoms, treatments, or caregiver stress. And so the present tense conversation I'm now referring to is called a serious illness conversation. It's a conversation that includes the loved one, so the patient, the caregiver, as well as the provider, about values and goals in the context of the serious illness being faced. It includes a discussion about prognosis and what to expect from the illness and treatments. And the ultimate goal of this is to help with medical decision-making, to ensure that values and goals are at the center of decision-making, and that medical procedures or interventions or treatments are then chosen to best help meet those goals or values. And so what this slide shows is one of the tools clinicians can use to actually help facilitate such a conversation. And so this is a conversation guide we use at Newton-Wellesley and Mass General Brigham to help navigate this conversation. And on the right, lists the rationale behind having a serious conversation using this tool, because really it helps us focus on how people want to live as opposed to what treatment or intervention is necessarily available, because they're not always going to produce the outcomes that we hope for. And it really encourages us to speak the truth about what patients are really going to be facing in the future, so that we don't lose time in helping people achieve their true goals. And so as a caregiver, you can be empowered to advocate, to engage in these conversations with your loved ones' clinicians, and prepare ahead of time for the discussion. I think one point I want to make is, and Julie emphasized this as well, this is very much about empowering the person who's facing the illness. And so if your loved one is decisional, they will need to be at the center of the conversation, and they will need to agree to the discussion. You can't speak to their providers without their knowledge or approval. But it is important, though, to be present when these conversations do occur as another set of eyes and ears, and especially as an advocate, so you can ensure that the values and goals will always be honored and respected. So one of the things you can do is prepare for this visit, and I'll share with you on the next slide some concrete things and questions to ask to help prepare. And don't be afraid to ask for the information that you need to fully understand what's going on, and to ask for clarification. And always bring whatever documentation you may have, such as a healthcare proxy or living will, to these appointments. So how to prepare to speak with clinicians about serious illness. So this is where the website Conversation Project can be very helpful. They have the What Matters to Me workbook, which is a workbook for people with serious illness. And you can take the time to prepare ahead of time to think through these prompted questions, so that you can have a really thorough discussion with your healthcare provider about what's truly important and what you're hoping, or what the loved one is hoping that medical care will accomplish for them. And once again, additional questions are also available on the Conversation Project, which is called Your Guide to Talking with the Healthcare Team, that can round out a serious illness conversation with some really practical questions that may not be thought of in the moment by the healthcare provider. And I think, I just want to emphasize once again, if you have sort of one appointment with a serious illness conversation, that isn't the only time to have these discussions. It can be conducted in many parts. It can be conducted over again, depending on how things go. But it is a starting point that needs to be continued. So just in summary, there are 3 major phases through adult life to ensuring values and goals are prioritized in the healthcare setting. The first is choosing a healthcare proxy, which we advise for anyone age 18 or older. The next is then engaging in these advanced care planning conversations over time with your loved one about future preferences for care. And then at the onset of frailty and serious illness, then start engaging with clinicians and loved ones in the context of illness and prognosis, as preferences may change from before. There are benefits to these conversations, including reduced burdens on loved ones and caregivers, and help everyone maintain some semblance of control. And these conversations are iterative processes, and there are many resources to help. So what can you do now? Go check on the healthcare proxy status and ensure that one gets completed. Look on the conversation project and start downloading some of the guides to help think through how to initiate a conversation with your loved one. And when faced with a serious illness, engage with your loved one and their clinicians, and start thinking about having a serious illness conversation using the What Matters to Me workbook. So that was a brief whirlwind. I think we're going to now transition back to question and answer.
Yes, thank you both so very much. That was just fantastic information and gave us a lot to think about. But then also you provided such useful tools and resources that, as we have mentioned several times, we'll be providing those after the webinar as well. And we have had some great questions, both that have been posted visually on the Q&A as well as some anonymous ones. So I actually want to ask initially a question of one for each of you. And I think there are 2 that are fairly common. So the first is, and maybe this would be for Dr. Dakor, is how do you handle disagreement when kids don't agree with parent choices? And I think that's probably can be top of mind for a lot of people.
So I think this is a multifaceted, multi-layered, sort of nuanced issue, and I'm sure Julie has her perspective on this as well to add in. And so I think, you know, the question is what is the disagreement about, and what is the underlying issue driving that disagreement? You know, I think is the disagreement about sort of healthcare that's being pursued, is the disagreement about where the parent is wanting to live versus the children feeling like it's not a safe place for them to live. And I think it's so nuanced, but I think, you know, taking an example of the children feel like it may not be safe for the parent to live in an independent place, but the parent wants to continue to live independently, is I think a very common one that we encounter when a parent is hospitalized and we're thinking about discharge plans. And I think, you know, as from a clinical side of things, I think one of the first things that we try to do is pull everybody into the same room, and to just get everybody in, sort of have a mediated conversation with everybody's views out there to understand what is each person's worry that's driving this difference. I think another piece of this is what providers are always doing in the background in these situations when people are facing serious illness or frailty is assessing what are people's, you know, what is your loved ones, your parents' true capacity to understand what their situation is. And if there is a worry that they may not have the capacity, maybe making a decision that's not fully informed, then that's when we start either engaging in what we call supported decision-making models, where we kind of start weighing some of the adult children's input a little more while the parents can sort of inform some of their preferences, versus that's when we maybe have to invoke a healthcare proxy to then sort of override the parents' decisions in a certain way. There are also painful circumstances where parents may have the capacity to make decisions and they're just making bad decisions. And then that's when we take an approach of harm reduction. You know, if they're still insistent on living independently and they understand the risks, will they at least accept a compromise of putting in some types of services or check-ins to accomplish that? So it's a very kind of nuanced process without an easy answer most of the time.
Great, thank you. I'm not so sure any of this is easy, so that's helpful information. And Julie, I'm wondering, this question came in, are there resources or information for caregivers that have left the workforce in order to care for their parents?
There certainly are. I mean, some people still have access to their previous workplace and can get information from an employer if they have a good relationship. But otherwise, certainly, I mean, the Aging Network is an excellent resource in terms of information. And the wonderful thing about the Aging Network is sort of they have the no wrong door policy, meaning that you can basically call up, for example, your aging service access point, ASAP, and ask a question, and they will always be able to direct you in the right direction so that you can speak to someone who can give you specific answers. But definitely when you're in the workplace, that is the time to make use of the whatever services your employer has. And the other thing I always say to people is, if your employer doesn't provide services that you would be interested in, is please speak up to your employer. A lot of employers don't fully realize the stress that many of their employees are under, as unfortunately employees hold back a lot of the information about their caregiving responsibilities. So the employer thinks that everything's going smoothly, and then the poor employee is struggling to try and meet all the demands of the work and the home and the let's say the aging parent.
That's great, thank you. So another question has just come in, and I think it's a great one, and a comment as well in what's being talked about tonight. And I'm wondering if both of you might be able to comment on it, is how does one find humor in the face of all the challenges? So that's a tough one, but I'm sure you both have a reflection for that.
I can certainly say a little bit about that in terms of my interaction with the caregivers on caregiver support groups, in that humor is vitally important for many of them, not for all. For some people, humor just does not work. But for those where humor is a tension releaser, they will often describe being able to find sort of the silly elements in whatever catastrophe that may have occurred, and be able to use humor and laughter to release the tension. And I'm a big advocate for using humor, because you need some ability to be able to reduce that sort of level of immense stress that many people are undergoing. So whatever way that you can use to try and release or relieve that tension, whether it be humor, whether it be exercise, whether it be reading a great book or going out for a wonderful walk, use it.
Great. Dr. Takor?
I think that was beautifully said, Julie. I think I would have said the same thing. It's just there's permission, and you should use humor or whatever sort of healthy coping mechanism that you have within your toolkit. But I think humor is certainly a powerful and appropriate coping mechanism. And I love that, sort of find the silly things in the day and laugh about it, or in the memories. Like, it's okay to reminisce and say, remember when my, parent did this and now I'm doing this for them. And, you can find ways that work for you.
Great, thank you. We'll just kind of close out with maybe one or two more. So I guess, Dr. Chakor, if you could comment on, do you think that clinicians are becoming more comfortable with these conversations? Is it becoming more common language in terms of what you're finding in your healthcare world?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I sort of in the interest of time, I sort of diverted away from talking about why we need to have guides to have these conversations. And I do think it was never a structured part of the curriculum of medical and nursing schools on how to talk about serious illness with your patients. And so that's why we have sort of found ourselves in this position. But people are now realizing that the importance of having very strong communication skills is just as much of a skilled procedure as, you know, a surgeon spends honing their craft as well. And so now, you know, schools and training programs have become aware of this and are now introducing it into the curriculum. And we also have training programs here, you know, at Mass General Brigham and Newton-Wellesley Hospital to work with our providers to become more comfortable in having these conversations. And so change is happening, but this is also a huge culture change, which we know happens slowly. So we're not at the point where we should be, but people are definitely more aware that these conversations need to happen.
And if I could just add a little bit, I think also the pandemic really has given us sort of a time to reflect on what the meaning of life, and realizing that the way we are in a certain situation can change very dramatically, whether it be internal or external circumstances. So I think people are also more willing to have these conversations than they were before, which I think hopefully helps the providers as well, in that the two sides are able to speak more openly and frankly about this.
Great. Those are excellent comments. And I think actually a nice way to end, because that's kind of, I think, a nice viewpoint of what all of that has been discussed today. So I want to thank you both so much for all the information, sharing your expertise and your time tonight with all of us, and to again let the folks who are here attending know that resources are going to be provided to all of you via an email that will be sent out from the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Collaborative in the next few days, definitely by the end of the week. And then just as a reminder that these educational programs are ongoing as part of our community outreach. They're all listed as a menu on our website, www.nwh.org. So please continue to look at those and to register for any that are of interest to you and that would be helpful in terms of different things that you're facing or your family is facing in your life. And please also pass that along to family and friends to join as they can. And we really want to thank all of you for joining and for spending the time. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of the evening and a good week. Thank you.